For those of you who don't know me, I am Gary Ackerman, president of the Book Club of Washington, and would like to welcome members of the Book Club of Washington and the Haines and Dunaway Society and others who have heard about today's presentation on the Lewis and Clark Expedition collections held in the aptly named Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. Our speakers today are Lewis and Clark Professor Emeritus in History, Stephen Dow Beckham, and Lewis and Clark Special Collections Librarian E.J. Carter. We are particularly delighted to be co-hosting today's event with our sister organization in Oregon, the Haines and Dunaway Society, with whom we have some history. Some members of the Book Club of Washington will fondly remember a dinner with members of the Haines and Dunaway Society and a reception at Dennis Anderson's house on our visit to Portland, which was around 10 years ago. Dennis was a long-term president of the Book Club of Washington before moving to Portland and becoming active in your club. I'm reminded that that at the dinner that we had at the University Club in Portland, our speaker that evening was none other than Professor Beckham, who we welcome today. And so we're so delighted to have you again in our midst. I remember hearing Roger Wendlick speak at a Book Club of Washington event. It must have been 15 or 20 years, probably 20 years ago, in which he talked about his collection and how, he called himself a ditch digger, was able to amass a fantastic collection of Lewis and Clark materials, which we're going to hear certainly more about that today. But it occurred to me as we were thinking through programs for this year that it had been quite a while since we had visited this subject, that I thought it might be something we could do remotely, hopefully. And so we contacted, Cindy Richardson from our board contacted E.J. Carter, and he said he'd be delighted. And then I thought about the co-hosting opportunity and contacted Scott Howard. And he said, well, maybe we can have Professor Beckham join us. And so this thing started from a small nucleus and it's really developed into what promises to be a really wonderful program today. So while we're doing this program, let me say it this way. While we would like to do this program in person, meetings via Zoom does offer some advantages in terms of convenience to speakers and audience alike. But perhaps in the not too distant future, we will visit Portland again and see the Lewis and Clark expedition materials firsthand. In any event, I hope to continue the collaboration between our two clubs across state lines whenever the opportunity presents itself. A word about logistics. I would ask everybody except our presenters to remain on mute while the presentations are going on. Questions can go into chat, and we should have time for Q&A after. I'm now going to turn the program over to Scott for him to introduce our first speaker, Professor Beckham. After Professor's talk, I will be back to introduce E.J. Carter. Okay, Scott, I'm going on mute.
Gary, thank you. It's hard to believe that it was 2013, 9 years ago, when we last got together with both of the groups. And so wonderful to do this. Our group has had a couple of different webinars, seminars like we're doing today, Zoom meetings, where we've attracted people that we would otherwise not have. I see Jane's on the phone. Jane, because of you, we have held a number of book collecting contests, and Haines and Dunaway this year is doing a University of Oregon book collecting contest among the students. It's wonderful to see what some of these collections. Gary, I don't know what you do for your holiday gathering. Our traditional holiday gathering has been a white elephant book exchange, and it has become hilarious of what people have come up with. Books like do-it-yourself coffins. There's some we can't mention. We have to hide them when we see them, but good to be back together again. It's quite a privilege for me to introduce to you, or for those you already know, Stephen Beckham, to reintroduce my friend to you. This will be his fourth presentation to Haines and Dunaway, and as always, we're excited about it. Couple of notes about Stephen Dow Beckham. He is a noted American historian, known principally for his work with Native Americans, the American West, the Pacific Northwest, and the Lewis and Clark expedition. With a master's degree and a PhD degree from UCLA, he spent 42 years teaching undergraduates and law students at Lewis and Clark, earning a number of well-deserved awards for his teaching. I'm not going to embarrass my friend by going through the multitude of awards he has won. I will tell you that after one presentation to Haines and Dunaway, I asked a student of his who's also a member of our group if that was a typical Beckham lecture, and he said he hasn't lost a beat. Stephen has served as an expert witness in more than 40 court cases involving tribal treaty rights, reservation boundaries, tribal status, casinos. Most recently, he was the expert witness for the state of Oregon in the long-running dispute as to whether the public has any right to access Oswego Lake, which is this beautiful lake here in the Portland area. The owners around the lake were trying to keep that from happening. I was pleased to meet Steve in May of 2010 when the fledgling Haines and Dunaway Society went to a presentation at Lewis and Clark College Library. We learned quickly that night to buckle up and hold on to our seats as Stephen took us on a whirlwind tour of the college's collection of discovery and exploration of the Northwestern United States. Hold on to your seats, buckle up. Here's Stephen Dow Beckham.
Thank you, Scott and Gary and Tim for the logistical arrangements, as well as the invitation to join book club members in Washington and Oregon and elsewhere this afternoon. Truly, the holdings at Lewis and Clark College are a rare and wonderful research collection. I was engaged to come to Lewis and Clark for a very specific reason. I was hired to build on the name and location of the college, an assignment that I carried for nearly 4 decades. First, I was to teach courses on the American West, and that involved Native Americans, environmental history, federal policy toward tribes, and research methods. I was secondly to develop off-campus courses for experiential learning, and we did that in many occasions, in fact, more than 40. I was to develop an interface with the public, which meant eventually serving on the board of the Oregon Historical Society, the Native Arts Council, the State Advisory Commission on Historic Preservation, and Restore Oregon. And my fourth assignment was to extend the college's reach through writing books and exhibits, and those extended eventually from the Library of Congress all the way to the Hong Kong Museum of History. In 1977, I began thinking about the prospects of building on the name of the college by teaching a course to retrace the route of the Lewis and Clark expedition between 1803 and 1806. And I found a kindred spirit in Ed Florence, a newly hired professor of biology whose expertise was botany. So we put together a summer field course, each of us taking 14 students or 28 total to go on the trail of Lewis and Clark from the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean. No sooner did word get out that this course was to be offered than I received a note from Dr. Eldon Chenard, an orthopedic surgeon in Portland, widely known as Frenchie. And he said, here's some extra copies I have of Ralph Space's Lolo Trail. I thought maybe your group could make use of them. Well, this is an account of the Bitterroot Mountain crossing, the most arduous and perhaps dangerous, life-threatening experience that the Corps of the Discovery encountered in 1805 and in 1806 on the return journey. And Frenchie shared with me several copies of this pamphlet. Within about 4 weeks of receipt of the pamphlet, Professor Florence on the left and Ralph Space in the center were talking to my students at Weippe, Prairie and Packer Meadows in eastern Idaho. We had actually arranged to have a wonderful series of speakers. We traveled with 3 vans, a dozen canoes, a Mackenzie River drift boat, and portable stoves to retrace that Lewis and Clark expedition route for 24 days across the Pacific Northwest. Eventually, through Lewis and Clark College, I would run 8 expeditions over the Bitterroots, several times hiking the trail, 3 times riding it on horseback, having a wonderful outdoor learning experience, actually stepping in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery. Our experiences included beautiful summer sun, driving rain and thunder and lightning storms, as well as early snows that nearly closed the trail. In this period, word came out from the National Endowment for the Humanities that they were to offer special funding for public programs for libraries. Leonore Svets Ingraham, then director of the Watzek Library and a member of the Haines and Dunaway Society, and I thought we could apply for such a grant. So Leonore and I went to a grant writing workshop in California, and in short order, we skipped the $10,000 planning grant and brought in over $300,000 for 3 years of programming through the campus Watzek Library. One of those elements was a symposium, Enlightenment Science in the Pacific Northwest, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And for that, we borrowed books. Leonore and Professor Willingham, in fact, developed a comprehensive bibliography of the private collection on the Lewis and Clark expedition of Dr. Eldon G. Chenard and his wife, Fritzie. Little did I realize that this was the predicate to the gift of the marvelous Chenard Library to Lewis and Clark College, which really started to accelerate the rare book collections that were so integral to the curriculum that I was teaching in the undergraduate college and eventually in the law school. I was also soon aware that my graduate advisor, John Walton Coy, and his wife, Laree, who were then nearly 90, were ready to dispose of their marvelous library in Southern California. John was my PhD and master's thesis advisor at UCLA. He taught 40 years in the college classroom, and during that period wrote 20 important books and edited the Pacific Historical Review for 27 years for the American Historical Association. His textbook, California, went through 5 editions over a 50-year period. This is on the left, the 4th edition, where he brought in Norris Hundley, his successor as editor of the PHR, to join him. This was the most popular selling textbook on California history in the 20th century. Coy also wrote a wonderful biography of Hubert Howe Bancroft, whose private collection became the core of the Bancroft Library today at UC Berkeley. In 1965, John Coy published a textbook, Land of the Free, co-authored with his son-in-law, Ernest May, and African-American historian John Hope Franklin of the University of Chicago. This 8th grade textbook gained adoptions in California, Texas, and New York. I was the proofreader for this volume, and I remember so vividly when John opened the first royalty check, $1 million for the sale of an 8th grade textbook. So the Coues were aged and wanting to dispose of their library. The level of duplications at UCLA would have probably been 90% or 95%. Consequently, they gave their entire collection to Lewis and Clark College. These were 3,200 volumes of Americana on California and the Southwest, Native American history and culture, as well as numerous examples of fine press work, particularly of the presses of California. So it took us a week to load the library from the mansion in Bel Air where the Coues lived and get it into a U-Haul truck and haul this marvelous collection north on Interstate 5 and unload it into the Watzek Library. Another library that the college was able to acquire in the 1980s was that of historian teacher Professor Francis D. Haines. Frank Haines taught at the Oregon College of Education, today Western Oregon University in Monmouth. His books covered the Nez Perce, the Appaloosa Horse, the Buffalo, and particularly history on the Columbia Plateau. Dr. Haynes's grandson, Keith Woodard, was one of my students at Lewis and Clark College. And after his grandfather's passing, Keith raised the prospect of the family giving his research library to Lewis and Clark College. The college gladly accepted the Haines Library. Another remarkable library came through the friendship of the college with the family of C.E.S. and Erskine Wood. Erskine Wood, an admiralty lawyer in Portland, spoke at Lewis and Clark the year he was 100 years old. He had a remarkable longevity as an attorney, as did his father, Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and a great tradition of benevolence. Wood Hall, a gift of $15 million to Lewis and Clark College, is a primary building of the law campus. But also there came the Wood Family Library with memorabilia. And I mean the library, the whole thing came to Lewis and Clark College. The Wood Library from the home in Vancouver, Washington, is replicated at Lewis and Clark, adjacent to the dean's office at the law school, with the original furniture, bronze medallions by Augustus St. Gaudens, autographed items, books, and Chief Joseph's beaded leggings that are on either side of the fireplace mantle in those alcoves. The collection includes correspondence and diaries, including Erskine Wood's diary that was published at My Boyhood with Chief Joseph, when he lived with Chief Joseph on the Colville Reservation in the 1890s, photo albums, manuscripts of unpublished and published works, watercolors, the St. Gaudens materials, family books, as well as American and British literature and history. It's a marvelous collection that came with significant endowment funds that have so transformed legal education at Lewis and Clark College. There was also another serendipitous event. In the early 1890s, Elliott Coues, MD, the nation's foremost ornithologist, was busy publishing edited editions of early exploration and travels. This was before Reuben Thwaites did the similar task in the early 20th century. In 1891-92, Coues was preparing the history of the expedition under the command of Lewis and Clark that was published in the print shop of Harper and Brothers in New York in 1893 in 4 volumes. In order to prepare this edition, Coues persuaded the American Philosophical Society to loan him the original journals. Coues took them to Washington, D.C., where Mary Anderson did a drawing by drawing, word by word, page by page, exact facsimile of the original journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The late book dealer and collector George Tweney of Puget Sound had obtained the Coues-Anderson facsimile and was ready and willing eventually to sell it, and it was purchased by Lewis and Clark College. The Anderson-Coues manuscript is available in digital format prepared by the specialty collections department at Watzek Library in 2003. What's particularly remarkable about this facsimile is that Mary Anderson understood the orthography very much in the word usage of the 19th century when she was working with these materials. And thus, where there are occasions of debate, reference to the actual wording and spelling is often confirmed in this facsimile of the original journals. Perhaps the most significant, the most significant acquisition, however, in the Western Americana collections at Lewis and Clark was the library assembled by Roger Wendlick. Had the privilege of joining Roger with lunch today, Sunday, and recalled at several occasions his marvelous autobiography, Shotgun on My Chest, Memoirs of a Lewis and Clark Book Collector. For those of you who have a bit of a passion for books, and I assume that's most of our listeners today, let me say that Roger's account of building this collection on the Lewis and Clark expedition is a true adventure in reading and use of Visa cards and mortgaging one's home and having an unrelenting passion for history. Roger attempted to acquire every publication on the core of discovery and much of its context. And he largely achieved that objective, I think, having only missed the printing of an edition of the message of the president that was hand set in type in Natchez, Mississippi, shortly after the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis. Among the many features of the Wendlick, Chenard, Haines, Coy, and other libraries that made up the core of the Western history holdings at Lewis and Clark College are volumes that relate to the traveling library. The traveling library was the first collection of books to make the full transit of North America, from the East Coast to the Pacific Ocean. These were the volumes that were carried by the Corps of Discovery between 1803 and 1806. These included the multi-paneled, mounted on linen, Aaron Arrowsmith map showing the American West with the hypothetical chain of Rocky Mountains, well defined up in Canada because of Mackenzie's explorations, but entirely presumptive in this edition published before the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark also carried with them Owen's Dictionary of Arts and Sciences that had been published in 4 volumes in London in 1754-55. I like to think of Lewis and Clark hunkered down around the campfire, reading at night by candlelight from this Dictionary of Arts and Sciences, and posing to one another a passage about some interesting thing that they'd found in the accurate descriptions in this dictionary or encyclopedia, comprehending, as it says, the branches of useful knowledge. Another item in the traveling library was Lepage du Pratz's History of Louisiana, published in 1763. Du Pratz lived in Natchez. He had traveled up the Mississippi and out onto the eastern part of the Great Plains. His volume included a folding map, largely hypothetical, but with some specific information about the Indian tribes of the Washita, Red River, and the lower Missouri. Richard Kirwan's Elements of Mineralogy, published in London in 1784, also came with the Corps of Discovery. Mineralogy and geology was one of the items of instruction from President Jefferson to Meriwether Lewis. Johann Mueller, or John Miller, as he was known in London, had published an illustration of the sexual system of Linnaeus, beautifully illustrated with hand-colored plates. This was one of the botanical manuals of importance employed by Meriwether Lewis in describing the more than 200 herbarium specimens he collected during the travels. Patrick Kelly's manual, Introduction to Spherics and Nautical Astronomy, 1796, was a volume along with Neville Maskelyne's tables requisite for determining latitude and longitude, an important consideration for the cartographic data that William Clark was recording. When their chronometer was not kept wound, of course, the captains lost control of longitude, but nonetheless, they carried this volume with them. They also had copies of George Vancouver's chart showing part of the coast that had been published in 1798, a very important atlas of exploration of the northwest coast of North America, accomplished during the Age of the Enlightenment by a maritime explorer. Just before the expedition would depart, Alexander Mackenzie's Voyages from Montreal was published with a folding map in 1802. I believe all of these volumes in the traveling library are from the library assembled by Roger Wendlick. And they enabled us to really get some understanding about the mindset and the context for Lewis and Clark and their journey from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. There was also another manual, Elements of Botany, published in 1803 by Benjamin Smith Barton. In the center is his illustration of Wappito, or Sagittaria latifolia, with its distinctive arrowhead-shaped leaf. On the left is a photograph of that plant growing at Skamakawe on the lower Columbia. And on the right, its tuber or bulb that sustained both Native American populations as well as feeding the hungry members of the Corps of Discovery. Another really interesting aspect of the Wendlick collection are the surreptitious and apocryphal books. There was so much interest in the Lewis and Clark expedition that a number of publishers between 1809 and 1812 and after published bogus accounts of the expedition with totally fanciful illustrations, such as this Sioux warrior on the left. Some of these were published in German for the Pennsylvania Dutch reading communities in Pennsylvania. These are an interesting sidebar to the more accurate accounts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but were widely read. Other gems in the holdings at Lewis and Clark College are the original 2-volume edition of the History of the Expedition, edited by Nicholas Biddle and Paul Allen, published in Philadelphia by Bradford and Inskeep in 1814. This copy from the Lewis and Clark collection is in its original boards. This was an original edition of about 2,000 copies, of which perhaps 50 survive today. The volumes were so popular, they were literally read to pieces after their publication in 1814. This set was the gift of Lawrence Shaw to Lewis and Clark College in the 1950s. It really began the college's Western Americana holdings. That volume, or those volumes, also include Clark's magnificent map of travels that was engraved by Samuel Lewis in 1814, a large folding map, which is often missing from surviving sets of the early journals. Other items from the Wendlick and Chenard collections included the diaries of Patrick Gass, who was the first member of the expedition to be published. Gass was also the last survivor of the expedition, living almost to 100 years in age. In the center is his journal with its eggshell blue paper covers, published by Arthaus Bertrand on the on the shore of the Seine River in Paris in 1810, and another volume published in Weimar in 1814. I think also of interest is the Frederick Pursh's American Flora, 1814, in 2 volumes. That was the first scientific notice of the marvelous botanical specimens collected by Meriwether Lewis. More than 220 of those specimens are preserved today at the Museum of Natural History in Philadelphia. Well, what has Lewis and Clark College done with these holdings? Among the things that we did in 2003 was to curate and offer the literature of the Lewis and Clark expedition. This traveling exhibition went around the United States for 3 years between 2003 and 2006. Its first opening was at the brand new Thomas Jefferson Research Library at Monticello. The exhibit from Lewis and Clark College was the first to be shown in 12 beautiful cases with the same woodwork as appears at the Jefferson Library. This collection then moved to the Boston Athenaeum and to St. Louis and to Denver. It traveled the United States where as curator, I gave opening lectures, and we debuted the history of the expedition through the literature. Another thing that the college accomplished was to gain another $300,000 plus grant for Unfinished Journey. These were 12 hour-long programs that were aired on National Public Radio. They covered many topics, including the journals, Sacagawea and American mythology, law and sovereignty, Meriwether Lewis, the expedition's complex leader, and so on. These were widely used by a general public as well as in schools. And finally, the college published on the left the literature of the Lewis and Clark expedition. 3 college bibliographers, Doug Erickson, Jeremy Skinner, Paul Merchant, and Professor Beckham went to work. I researched and wrote the essays, and the bibliographers then presented a comprehensive bibliography of the first century of publications relating to the Corps of Discovery. This is an oversized volume of nearly 350 pages, beautifully illustrated. And as a sidebar, I also did a volume with photographer Robert Reynolds, 44,000 words, Lewis and Clark from the Rockies to the Pacific. So President Jefferson, I think, had it right when he said, an officer with 10 or 12 chosen men fit for the enterprise and willing to undertake it, taken from our posts, where they might be spared without inconvenience, might explore the whole line, even to the Western Ocean. So Lewis and Clark College has the rare and remarkable opportunity to share its research collections with generations of students and scholars who will make the journey to the Boley or Watzek libraries on campus. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely terrific, Professor Beckham. I now see that it's no accident that there is a correlation between the collections there and the name of the college. It was intentional, and how fortunate for us here in the Northwest to have the college devote such resources and your energies to developing that collection, and not just developing it, but publicizing it through your books and through that fantastic touring exhibit that went to some wonderful institutions. Yeah. We will hold questions for Professor Beckham till, let's hear from E.J. first, and then we can open it up for some Q&A. E.J. Carter is a special collections and research librarian at Lewis and Clark College. In that capacity, he is a liaison to the history, economics, international affairs, and public and political science departments at the college. Before coming to Lewis and Clark, he was special collections librarian at Chicago State University. He's published articles in RBM, a journal of rare books, manuscripts, and cultural heritage, in which I checked that up because I didn't know RBM. It sounds like that's Rare Books Magazine, but I wasn't sure. And in fact, that's what it that is what it means. And his very scholarly article on the death of correspondence, essentially the effect of the digital age. I did not read that, EJ. It's pretty long, but anyway, I was just curious to see what our BM meant anyway, and also other publications such as Central Europe History, Notre Dame Magazine, and Northwest Review of Books. EJ has a PhD in history and a library degree from the University of Illinois. He enjoys reading, but perhaps hopefully that's not a rare occupation or interest in librarians, and running, which may be in fact rarer. But it is, I can assure you, a nice combination since I at least in my younger years did both. Now I'm confined mostly to reading. EJ is going to continue the theme of travel and exploration, introduce to us some items and special collections that date from the 18th century and earlier. And we've asked him to talk about several other collections that are noteworthy. These are the papers of William Stafford and a collection of materials from relating to Camp Waldport, one of 3 civilian public service camps in Oregon for conscientious objectors during World War II. So I didn't confirm in our discussion beforehand, before we got whether in fact you are going to cover those, but that's what that's what is advertised. So EJ, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Gary, and thanks everybody for coming. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the other materials that we have in our special collections at Lewis and Clark. Of course, I wish I could give you a tour of these things in person, but if you're ever in Portland, please feel free to stop by and we'll be happy to show you around. The Lewis and Clark expedition materials that Professor Beckham talked about are certainly the heart of our special collections. They're the first major collection that we built and established, going back to the 70s and 80s and 90s. But those collections, those materials have also provided, I think, a theme that has kind of tied together many of the collections we've built subsequently. And that's the idea of exploration, discovery, travel, adventure. This is sort of the thread running through a lot of our materials, and it's what I want to emphasize today in the items that I'll be talking about. So first, I want to give you a sense of our reading room. It's relatively small, but this is one wall in our rare book collections. It features mostly material from the Lewis and Clark expedition collections. So this would be Roger Wendlick's collection, along with George Tweney and Eldon Chenard's materials. A lot of these are the less valuable scholarly monograph type materials. The older ones, of course, are in safes. On another wall are some maps and photographs, including a copy of the Arrowsmith map that Professor Beckham talked about earlier. And then a third wall has more general rare book collections. And this is where we really get into a broader array of travel and tourism and exploration type materials. Here, for example, is Captain Cook's voyages from 1790. This isn't the first edition, but it's a relatively early edition. And we have other materials sort of in this vein, both US travel writing as well as more global accounts of travel. And some of these, kind of a sub-collection of this material includes natural history writings that involve travel. So we have materials from Darwin and Louis Agassiz and people like that. We also have some items in our manuscript collections on this theme. This is a more recent acquisition. It's a captain's log from a ship called Voyage to the East Indies of the Duke of Grafton from 1779 to 1781. So it describes a ship moving through the Indian and Atlantic Oceans toward the end of the 18th century. You may have noticed on the wall that I showed earlier an image of C.E.S. wood, and Professor Beckham talked about the wood collection. So I will skip over this a little bit, but just to emphasize that wood kind of combined a life as a prominent member of the establishment in Portland, where he did a lot of work with banks involving securing the rights to railroad land grants. And he kind of combined those with these very bohemian and increasingly radical political views. So he was a socialist and a pacifist. He opposed US entry into World War I pretty vigorously. He had kind of an amateur career as an impressionist painter, and had a lot of painter friends who would come out from New York and paint the Oregon countryside with him. But of course, Wood's real claim is as the person who, at least allegedly, took down the surrender speech of Chief Joseph in 1877. And that led to this friendship that enabled his son, Erskine, to travel in the 1890s to the Nez Perce Reservation. And that's where he kept that journal over a couple of summers. That's probably one of the most popular manuscript items in our collection. Students really enjoy working with that document. He also took a lot of photographs. So here's an image of Chief Joseph's ponies drinking water from a photo taken by Erskine Wood. The next collection I want to talk about is that of William Stafford. So Stafford's the most famous Oregon poet. He was a faculty member here at Lewis and Clark. He was a winner of the National Book Award and Poet Laureate of the United States in 1970 to 71. At that time, it was called Library of Congress Consultant in Poetry. And Stafford was known for having a very rigorous writing practice. He would rise every morning at 4 o'clock and spend an hour or two writing while the house was still quiet. And he kept those drafts, those poetry drafts that he produced during that daily writing practice very meticulously. And in those series of drafts, you can really see the evolution of his poetry, new ideas coming about, experimenting with poetic phrases. And so this is something that's really valuable for poets and poetry classes that they like to study. But I think one reason that Stafford is particularly beloved in Oregon and throughout the Northwest is that he was such an inveterate traveler. He would go on these long car trips across Oregon and Washington and British Columbia. He would write poems about the places that he visited. Here is a draft of his poem about Lake Chelan from 1960. And incidentally, it bears relatively little connection with the published poem that actually emerged. You can kind of see some themes, but in terms of the actual words and phrases, they evolved quite a bit over his writing process. So I think it's really this ability to leave his stamp on so many places in the Northwest that is part of Stafford's lasting legacy. So like C.E.S. Wood, Stafford was a pacifist, and rather than join the army during World War II, he served at a couple of civilian public service camps in Northern California. The CPS camps were alternatives to military service that usually involved some form of public service projects. In Oregon, this usually took the form of logging, forestry, firefighting, fighting wildfires in particular. And so this is another theme that we've become interested in. There were several CPS camps in Oregon, particularly the ones at Cascade Locks, and this is an image of that along the Columbia River, and then the one at Waldport along the coast. And a number of people in the camp at Waldport were interested in the arts, and they received permission to set up a fine arts program. The most prominent person in that camp was the poet William Everson, but there were other people there who were writing and acting in plays. Here's an image from Edna St. Vincent Millay's Aria da Capo. They were also writing newsletters and other literary works. They were engaged in printmaking, fine printing. Here's an image of Everson at the printing press at Waldport. They're musicians, so all kinds of different arts being practiced. And so we have a number of different collections from these camps. The biggest one is the Kermit Sheets papers. He was originally at the Cascade Locks camp, but he had an interest in playwriting and acting, and so he requested a transfer to the Waldport camp. And then after the war, many people in the fine arts program at Waldport migrated down to San Francisco, and in many cases played a key role in the beginning of the San Francisco Renaissance after the war. There's a book by Steve McQuitty from a few years ago, at least, that makes this argument that the Waldport CPS camp provided a kind of nucleus for the subsequent San Francisco Renaissance. So Kermit Sheets was part of this group. He went down to San Francisco, became involved in a number of theater troupes and worked as both an actor and a playwright. He had a playwriting partner, James Broughton, who later became a prominent avant-garde kind of underground filmmaker, sort of in the Kenneth Anger mold. And this kind of leads to what I think are some of the more surprising and interesting documents in this collection. These are letters from the film critic Pauline Kael to Kermit Sheets. This is when Pauline Kael was in exile in Santa Barbara in the late 1940s, having a baby. So the father of the baby was James Broughton, Kermit Sheets's playwriting partner, drama partner. But apparently in the late 1940s, even members of sort of the Bohemian underground had to go into exile to have a child out of wedlock. And so these letters are quite heartrending. She's very lonely and bored and kind of scared. But by the last letter, her life has sort of started to take shape a little bit more. She talks about having an agent and starting to write plays and film reviews. And a couple of years after that, she would move to New York and start to write for the New Yorker. Okay, and then finally, there's one last document that I want to show. This is from our YMCA collection. This is another collecting focus for us. We're kind of interested in activist and social organizations in Portland, so that we have the records of several different entities like that, including both the YWCA and the YMCA. Most of those materials don't have a lot to do with travel and exploration, but this one does. This is the report of the Travelers Aid Association of Portland. during the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in 1904. So this was an organization created during the Expo. You can see here some of the organizations involved in its creation, not just the YWCA, but also Women's Christian Temperance Union, for example. And then you'll also notice down here the superintendent of the organization was Lola G. Baldwin, who would become famous as the first female police officer in the United States. She was hired in 1908 as a detective in the Portland Police Department. And so she's the one who wrote most of this document. You can see here the beginning of the report. It starts with the president's report before going into the superintendent's report. But the aim of this association was to help women who were traveling alone in Portland during the Expo. You'll notice in that first paragraph, there's a mention of the 700 young women who disappeared during the World's Fair in Chicago. Many of you may have read that book by Eric Larson, The Devil in the White City, which is about a serial killer in Chicago during the World's Fair, preying on single women who had come there to work. And this kind of seems to be a reference to that. The pamphlet's a little bit vague in terms of what they mean by disappearing. I think probably what they mean is women who disappeared into prostitution, or possibly they just mean losing touch with family members and being reported as missing. But I think anybody who's read that Eric Larson book can't help but think about that that association. Anyway, the idea is that volunteers with the Travelers Aid Association would meet young women at the train station and make sure they were able to safely find lodging and jobs, keep them away from brothels or other dangerous parts of the city, in general, to keep them safe from people who might be preying upon them. So that's just kind of a sample of some of our holdings. You can see more at our digital collections website. And again, please visit us if you have the chance. Thanks.
Thank you, E.J. That's terrific. I look forward to my next trip down to Portland. We get there once a year, and I now have another interesting place to go when I get down there. And who knows? The Book Club of Washington had planned a trip to Oregon with a focus on visiting some of your fine used bookstores. That trip was scheduled for April or May of 2020, but had to be canceled due to the COVID pandemic. So we certainly have Portland on our collective list up here. Let's see what we have. If I can read the chat here, if there's anything. Some thanks. I'm not sure I see a particular question here. But let me open the floor up here for questions or comments. People can kind of unmute themselves, raise a hand. There's Mark. I see with a hand up. Unmute, Mark. You still need to unmute. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a book that was published in 1830. My copy dates to 1836. It's a history of the United States from the settlement of the colonies to the War of 1815. Or the peace of up to the end of the war with the hostilities with the British. My question is this: the Louisiana Purchase is not referred to as the Louisiana Purchase. In fact, it's barely referred to it at all. There is no mention of the Corps of Discovery or of Lewis and Clark or virtually anything except for the fact that it contains one of the world's great river systems. Were historians at this time just that behind in establishing the history or understanding the significance of the Louisiana Purchase, or is this just a gross omission?
History professor will respond. I think, Mark, that your book is like the national news, where weather only happens on the East Coast, or maybe between Texas and the Great Lakes. And the West Coast is seldom mentioned, or at most a footnote, both to national news and weather reporting. Let me say that a more robust history of the United States was that was soon published in multi-volumes by George Bancroft, who had served as Secretary of State, I believe, during the Jackson administration. By that point, there was a growing awareness of the highly significant lands west of the Mississippi River. That awareness also grew with the removal of the tribes from east of the Mississippi under the Indian Removal Act of the Jackson administration. So the book that you have may just be a product of its time. I think others were ready to acknowledge that the United States had become a continental nation with the prospective continental nation with the Lewis and Clark expedition. The forces were put in play for that to happen.
Thank you.
Looking here. David, you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. I think this question may be directed to Mr. Carter. You mentioned book collections that have gone to Lewis and Clark. Do you accept considerable collections that are well defined without having an endowment that follows the collection? Or does it depend upon the collection, of course?
Yeah, we certainly don't require any kind of endowment, but I would say our collecting criteria are limited primarily by considerations of theme as well as space. We have somewhat limited space, like many special collections, so there is a limit to what we can absorb. But yeah, we're always interested in donations.
Scott?
Professor Beckham, we have people from the Bancroft Library coming through Oregon on a fairly regular basis trying to pick off collections. There's been a former special collections librarian at Oregon was trying to wrestle this and has since left. How did you wrestle the Coe collection from Brentwood or Bel Air, California, under the nose of these other, I mean, the UCLA library is huge. Bancroft has miles and miles of uncatalogued. How did you do that?
Well, the acquisition of the Coe collection was a bit of a coup. When John got that first check for $1 million for Land of the Free, he and his wife, Laree, set up a foundation. And by 1984, I was named to serve on that foundation board. He had been my graduate advisor for 2 degrees at UCLA. I knew the collection very well because I was frequently in their home when I was a college student. And thus, when they were approaching age 90 and wanting to dispose of that library and aware that it would be, most of it would go into the duplicates sale bin at UCLA or UC Berkeley, they very generously gave the entire collection to Lewis and Clark. They knew it would be used. They knew it had a great curricular fit with what we were doing, particularly for the courses on Hispanic borderlands and Native Americans. And so it was a gift, a wonderful gift.
Steve and I went with Steve to the course, and they were a wonderful family. They believed so strongly in libraries and education, and what Steve was trying to do at Lewis and Clark was just marvelous.
Thank you, Leonore. Leonore and I were partners in a lot of this development of collections at the Watzek Library. We approached it rather like Henry Huntington. The fastest and quickest way to build a great library is to acquire other libraries, and that's exactly what we did.
So Gary, we looked at doing a program on this subject of Bancroft coming through here and so on. And we were dissuaded from doing that with a panel discussion because, and this was before COVID, because there were thoughts that a fist fight might break out between these marauding people. E.J. Carter, you did not mention, I think you just got Kim Stafford's collection to go with William. Do you have any kind of guess as to how many poems William Stafford wrote?
Not exactly. That's a great question. It's a lot, and Kim Stafford wrote a lot as well. But yeah, no, it's got to be in the thousands, I would think. But I don't have an exact number.
Kim, in the introduction to one of his father's books, published after his death, suggested the number could be in the 20 to 30,000 range. And Professor Beckham, you may know, and E.J., you may know, I don't think William Stafford really started writing poetry until he was in his 40s.
I believe you're right, Scott, but Bill was my teaching colleague at Lewis and Clark, and Bill and Dorothy were our neighbors by only a few blocks in Lake Oswego. As E.J. has pointed out, Bill Stafford was a disciplined writer. He attempted to craft some literary effort every day of his life. And though they had a household with 3 children, as E.J. pointed out, he was up and at it early. He was also a wonderful photographer, and he was always taking photographs everywhere he went, of faculty events, of his travels. And I believe, E.J., that's also part of the holdings at Lewis and Clark College.
Yep, that's right.
E.J., did you get the book of love poems from C.E.S. Wood, where he inscribed the book to his first wife, and then, being the thrifty man that he was, crossed out the inscription and inscribed it to his Sarah Bard Field, I think was his second wife. Did that come your way after Brian Booth's death?
Not that I know of. No, I haven't seen that particular item, but yeah, that would be worth having.
I think Stephen, you saw it at Brian's house one time.
I did. One of the memorable moments of my life was using my SUV to haul a lot of the Wood Library from Vancouver to campus. It was just fascinating to go through the house and round up the items. Lou Wood, the widow of Erskine, had outlived him by a number of years, even though he lived to be almost 103. And one of the St. Gaudens bronze medallions was underneath the sofa in the library. I remember crawling around on my hands and knees, pulling out works of art that also came to the college. And truly, that the Erskine and Lou Wood Library is fully replicated over at the law school. A real treat to see, particularly the beaded leggings of Chief Joseph that are part of the holding.
It sounded like quite a character. What a great photograph of CES. He looks like the hippie version of Albert Einstein in that photograph. But
The collection also includes several family albums of views from West Point days onward, and a fascinating letter of advice that C.E.S. Wood wrote to Erskine Wood when he was about to enter college. Also, some really interesting early accounts of automobile travel to Oregon's high desert. C.E.S. Wood enjoyed going with Child Hassam to do impressionist paintings in the Harney Basin. And some of that is documented in the family correspondence.
well, I want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank everybody that devoted their Sunday afternoon here with us today. I think it was certainly entertaining to me, and I got to, and I do look forward to making a trip down to Lewis and Clark College, picking up some of your books, Professor Beckham, and reading through them. What a distinguished author you are, and we're delighted to have you and EJ here today. So unless there are any other closing comments, I'd just say, I want to thank everybody from the Haines and Dunaway Society and the Book Club of Washington for participating in today's event. Okay, till next time.